Good morning, Sergeant Miller. Will you take the oath, please? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Thompson.
Good morning, Sergeant. What is your full name, please?
It's Ian Gordon Miller, but I'm known as Gordon.
How old are you, Sergeant?
I'm 54.
And you're a police sergeant with Police Scotland.
That's correct, yes.
You're currently in the Corporate Services Division, Volunteer Coordination Unit at Tullyallen,
That's correct, yes.
where you are the national lead for Police Scotland, youth volunteers and special constables.
That's correct, yeah, your unit is, yeah.
How many years police service do you have?
24.
Sergeant, before we begin, could you perhaps open up the blue folder in front of you?
Yeah,
There are some documents in there that you might find it helpful to refer to during your evidence. Let's look firstly at PERC 00151, which is an operational statement prepared by you on the 3rd of May of 2015. Is that right? Do you see that in that folder?
yep, I do, yeah.
Now, although it's got a PERC reference number, am I right to understand this was an operational police statement and not a statement that you gave to the PERC?
That's correct, yes.
So it's a self-penned statement, as it were.
That's right, yes.
And when you prepared that statement on the 3rd of May of 2015, were you doing your best to give a truthful and accurate account of the events of that day?
I was, yes.
Were you asked by the PERC to give them a statement?
Yes, I was at some stage, long time later, when I was in Perth. I was contacted and asked to provide a statement, which I did.
And that was to the PERC?
No, sorry, I beg your pardon. That was Tarn.
That was Operation Tarn.
Sorry, yeah, I wasn't asked to give one to PERC. I beg your pardon.
All right. I'll ask you about that in a moment. We certainly don't have a statement that you provided to the PERC. I just wanted to be clear as to whether you'd ever been asked to give a statement to the PERC.
No, I wasn't. No.
What about the Crown? Did the Crown ever ask to recognise you?
No.
And you mentioned being asked to provide a statement to Operation Tarn. That's Police Scotland.
Yes.
When was that?
It would be a couple of years ago.
You said it was when you were in Perth?
When I was working in Perth, yeah.
Okay. And did you give a statement to Operation Tarn?
I provided a statement. There was also a document that went with it that was signed off by your inspector. So that was provided with them as well.
Okay, I don't think I've seen that. What was the purpose of you giving a statement to Operation Tarn?
I think it was just a further in-depth statement from our operational one, as far as I can recall anyway.
You should also have in the folder in front of you the statement that you gave to a member of the inquiry team, and that was on the 6th of March of this year. We could maybe bring this one up on the screen, please. It's SBPI 00315.
Yep, that's correct, yeah.
Do we see this as your statement noted on the 6th of March of 2023? And if we scroll to the very bottom of the document, please. Do we see that it was signed by you on the 4th of May of 2023?
Yes, that'll be correct, yeah.
We can see that your signature has been redacted on the copy that's on display, but I think you should have a signed copy in your folder.
Yes, yeah.
And every page should have been signed.
Every page, yeah.
If we could look at paragraph 130, the very final paragraph, it states, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. So when you gave your statement, you understood that your statement would form part of your evidence and would be published in due course.
Yes.
And you said, I believe the facts stated are true. Did you do your best to be truthful and accurate when you gave this statement?
Yes.
Thank you. Also within your folder, and we don't need to put this on the screen at the moment, is the scene entry log for the home address of a Zahid Sahid. And that's got a reference number PS 18504. There should be a copy of that in front of you as well.
Yes.
So you have there your inquiry statement, your operational police statement, and a scene entry log. And if at any time you would find it helpful to refer to these documents, please do so. And if there's anything you'd like me to put up on the screen, then I can do that for you.
Okay, thank you.
I want to begin by asking you about your role in May of 2015. You explain in your statement that you joined the police in 1999,
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
and that as of May of 2015, you were a detective constable in reactive CID based at Leavenmouth Police Station.
Yes.
I wonder if we can look at paragraphs 10 and 11 of your inquiry statement where you explain your role and responsibilities. Our responsibilities, along with the crimes that we would have allocated to ourselves anyway and ongoing inquiries with that, we'd be looking at anything that the CID would be involved in. That would be high-level thefts, house break-ins, serious assaults, anything like that. We would be looking into drug-related stuff as well. Any of these crimes that were reported over the previous day, the way the crime file system worked at that time, there'd be a crime bulletin would be published the next morning, and it would just have the brief details of the crime number, the MO for the crime, and that would be it. We would go in the morning and would look at all the various crimes, read them, make sure that they were getting dealt with appropriately. All crimes, any ones that fell into our remit, we'd be taking on, but as far as crime management, we'd be looking at all crimes just to make sure that they're taking the right lines of inquiries with everything. So you explain in those paragraphs essentially what your role in CID at that time involved. And you conclude by saying we'd be looking at all crimes just to make sure that they're taking the right lines of inquiry with everything. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Excuse me. Yeah, of course. So every day, the previous day's crimes would be published, if you'd like. So we'd go in, we'd look at them, and we'd be looking at every crime just to make sure that the appropriate inquiries were getting carried out, even if it didn't sort of fall into the remit of the CID. We would look at every single crime.
Okay, what do you mean by appropriate inquiries? What sorts of things would you be checking?
Well, just if there was suspects, making sure that they were aware of other crimes that they were maybe sought for, making contact. We would put an update on the crime file system for the reporting officer. If there was serious crimes, we would then look to take them on. Just anything like that, any inquiries that needed that. The actual crime file system at that time, the reporting officer or the officer, excuse me, that would be put their speaks to on to say exactly what they were doing. So simple things like if they'd carried out door to door, if they'd checked for CCTV inquiries, have they done appropriate researching of you know, anything to do with it.
So you're acting as a check and a balance, effectively, making sure that everything's done that needs to be done
Yes, yeah.
in the crimes that have been reported over the previous 24
Yes.
hours.
The undetected ones, I should say. The detected crimes were obviously past the post, if you like, but it was the undetected ones that we were predominantly interested in.
What do you mean by undetected?
There hadn't been somebody cautioned and charged for it. There hadn't been somebody identified as being responsible for that crime.
So crimes that have been committed and a report has been made, but you don't have a suspect.
Yes, correct, yeah.
Let's move on to the 3rd of May of 2015, and you explain in your statement that you worked a 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift, that you began your day at Cooper Police Station and printed the day's crime bulletin and went through it.
Yes.
If we can scroll down, I'm going to read the short slightly because I don't think any of this is more than background, but you explain at paragraphs 16 and 17, please, that while you were marking the bulletin, you heard a radio message about an incident in Kirkcaldy. The Kirkcaldy units were all tied up and they were looking for assistance. You informed the duty sergeant an incident had happened and they were looking for resources. So that's what you recall. You then explain at paragraph 19 that you did what needed to be done with the crime bulletin and drove up to Leavenmouth at the back of 9. DS Dursley was the DS on the shift and a DC Petrie was on the shift too. And at paragraph 20, you've explained that DS Dursley had gone to Kirkcaldy to assist and only DC Petrie was in the office. He had phoned through to see if you were needed and you were told to stay where you were. They had sufficient resources at that time. So that's all by way of background, Sergeant, but if we can perhaps look in more detail at paragraph 21. So you explain that you had heard certain information over the radio, but you explain at 21 that we had no idea of any details of the incident or anything like that. We just knew there had been an incident in Kirkcaldy, and we knew that a black male had been engaged and had subsequently died, being pronounced life extinct in the Victoria Hospital, Kirkcaldy. I think at that time they were trying to identify who the male was. We knew that it was a critical incident. We didn't have any specific briefing. I know when we were in the house, DC Petrie phoned DS Dursley a couple of times and just told him what was happening. So he'd been given advice at that time, which he would have passed on to myself, but he was very much in conversation with DS Dursley, who was involved in the incident. And if we can also look, before I ask you any more questions, at paragraph 23. I remember there was a radio message come across. I've no idea who it was. I presume it was members of the major investigation team that would have been in to investigate the incident, and they had shouted up over the police radio on the Leavenmouth channel saying that they had taken an address. I can't remember the number of it. On the instructions of the SIO, it was to be seized as a secondary locus. I also remember them saying that the house was empty, and that was it. I was aware that this had happened. They'd come and they'd taken away Mrs. Rashid's brother. I can't remember his name. They'd taken him away, I believe, and they had shouted up to secure the building, and the house was empty. We had no involvement at that time. We heard the control directing a police unit to go and carry that out. Never thought any more about it. So you explain in between paragraphs 21 and 23 that you had no idea of any of the details of the incident beyond the fact that a black male had been engaged and had died, and it had been declared a critical incident.
Yes.
And at paragraph 23, you explain that the MIT, the Major Investigations Team, I think that is,
Yes.
had shouted up that they'd taken an address, and on the instructions of the SIO, it was to be seized as a secondary locus. They'd shouted up to secure the building, and the house was empty. And you conclude that paragraph by saying that you heard control directing a police unit to go and carry that out, and you never thought any more about it. So you weren't required at that point in time.
No, the only reason we paid some attention to it is because it was within our area, so it was within the Leavenmouth Methyl area, so it come over the radio channel that this was happening. So that's all we knew at that time.
So this is happening in the background. You can hear the radio messages, but you have
Yes.
no direct involvement at this
That's
stage.
correct, yes.
We've heard evidence that a DS Dursley radioed and relayed instructions from the duty SIO that 2 officers were to secure the locus, and that he didn't think that anyone was at that address. And that would fit, I think, with what you heard coming over the radio. You refer to the address as a secondary locus or a secondary crime scene. What do you mean by that?
Just that it's got a connection with the incident, but not primarily. The incident hasn't happened there, but there's obviously a connection with the incident.
If we can look again at 24, please, where you explain that you had no idea of the direct connection or anything like that at the time. We just knew that it was secondary and it was on the instructions of the SIO. A decision had been made by the SIO that it was connected and that it was to be secured. So although you understood that this property was a secondary crime scene, you explain at 24 that you didn't know what the connection was.
That's correct, yes.
Do you recall who was the SIO that morning?
No, I had no idea at all, with no direct involvement, because I started up in Cooper and DC Petre was a later start. So when the initial incident happened, everybody had gone through, so we had no involvement at all at that stage.
Now, briefly in paragraph 25, you explain that securing and seizing a property mean the same thing. Can these terms be used interchangeably? Yes,
that's my understanding.
I want to ask you some questions now about the decision to go to this address. We'll refer to it as the address of Zahid Saeed. If we can look at paragraph 26, please. About 10 or 15 minutes after the radio message about seizing the property, there was a call from one of the officers that had attended to say that the house wasn't empty. There was people within it, and they weren't very happy about being asked to leave the house. It was at this stage I said to DC Petrie, "Look, we'll have to go and give them a hand, assistance-wise, because the response are there. They were told the house was empty, and we've got a diabetic grandmother who doesn't speak English, Mrs. Rashid, who had 2 young children, and the youngest just out of hospital, and another who is paraplegic." Saying the house was empty couldn't be a worse description of the house. And I want to ask you a few questions about that paragraph. You mentioned there being a call from one of the officers who had attended to say that the house wasn't empty. Now, we've heard evidence from a PC Fraser that he and a Constable Aitken were the response team who had gone to the house in the first instance. And PC Fraser had indeed radioed to say that the house was occupied. And in his evidence, the airwave message was put to him. It was 431 from 43 Bravo. The address is currently occupied. There is a female and her son, her brother and her mother, all here at this time. Details in as to who's within, and pass them back over. And the duty sergeant responded, "Yeah, that's all received. Just stand by and I'll get the DS to get directly in touch with you." I'm wondering if that might be the message that you heard when you said that there was a call from the response officer at the house to say that there was someone
I believe
there.
it was, yeah.
Now, in your statement to paragraph 26, you mentioned that the occupants weren't happy about being asked to leave. You mentioned a diabetic grandmother who didn't speak English, 2 young children, one just out of hospital, and someone who was paraplegic. Just to be clear, when did you receive that information about the occupants?
It wasn't until we were there. We didn't know that. We just knew that at that stage, we just knew that there was people within the address and that they were not wanting to leave.
Can we move on to paragraph 27, please? My recollection of going to the address was it was our decision to go to assist because we knew that there was very little resources because everybody in Kirkcaldy were backfilling across the division. Because of the timings of when it happened, the whole shift had been involved. Everyone was pulled in. Units would be presumably pulled in to do business as usual response work at Kirkcaldy. We knew that the resources were very light, and when that message was put out that there were people within the house, we knew there wasn't a lot, so we more or less volunteered ourselves to go along and try and assist response. It wasn't really to take over or anything like that. It was just to provide assistance, but when we got there, they were looking for us to take the lead. I'm pretty sure DC Petrie would have phoned DS Dursley to tell him that we're en route. He certainly phoned him from within a couple of times just to tell them what was happening and keep him aware, because obviously they, for some bizarre reason, thought the property was empty. And I want to ask some questions about what you say in this paragraph now. You say that you volunteered yourselves to assist. Is that right? You weren't asked to go to this address, you offered to help.
Yes, that's how I recall it, that we were aware of the extent of resources, so we knew there wasn't a lot of resources available, so we went along to assist, yeah.
Again, when Constable Fraser gave his evidence, radio messages were put to him in his evidence, and there was one from the duty sergeant to Constable Fraser. The CID are going to nip down. Basically, it's a case of obtaining details from people within, and we're going to try and get them elsewhere. But as I say, CID are going to come down with a car and give you a hand of that. And Constable Fraser replied to that message, yes, yes, we're just in the process of noting particulars. So that fits with what you explained, that you'd offered your services, and it would seem that behind the scenes, the response team were being advised that CID were going to come down and give them a hand. So it seems that uniformed officers were made aware that you were coming to give them a hand, although you explain in paragraph 27 that it wasn't to take over, it was just to provide assistance. Can you help us to understand what assistance you anticipated giving when you got there?
Yes, of course. It's just to try and to explain to the people within the household you know what was happening. Sometimes, obviously, uniformed officers are sometimes when we're in plain clothes, it comes better from us because they don't see the sort of police side of things. We went along to try and reassure them and try and explain the reasoning of why we needed to take the house.
If we can look at paragraph 28. About halfway down, all we knew, as far as I can recall, was that there were some people within the property and they weren't particularly happy about having to leave. So we were just going along to try and explain that to them. And you said a moment or so ago in your evidence that you were going to explain things to the occupants and also try to reassure them. What was it you were going to explain?
Well, just really that there had been a serious incident, and that through the investigation of that the decision had been made that they needed to secure that household in order to protect sort of evidence. We didn't know at that time exactly what they were looking for or that, but it was really just to provide that sort of communication with the family members to see if we could persuade and ask them to leave. Was really what it was about.
You said you were going to persuade them. What was it that you needed to persuade them about?
Well, they didn't want to leave the address. That was quite clear. They were quite annoyed actually when we got there. So it was difficult from the word go to try and get them on side to ask them to leave. But again, one of the greatest attributes you probably have as an officer is communication skills, so we were hoping that we were going to be able to reason with them and try and see what we could do to get them to go.
You said it was difficult to get them on side. Why was it important to get these occupants on side?
They were quite annoyed and upset at having to leave their address, which I don't fall out with at all. Yeah, so I mean, we were there to try and explain the side of the police, the need to to take the address, and that the forensic integrity of the address would have to be protected.
You said a few minutes ago in your evidence that as well as going to explain these things to the occupants, you were also going to reassure them. What were you going to reassure them about?
Just the fact that, we're there to do a job. We were going to try and make the transition as easy as possible, because ultimately we're in somebody's house on a Sunday lunchtime asking them to leave. So we've come into their sort of private space, if you like, but we just wanted to reassure them that we were there. There was a need, you know, to do that, and that's why we were there to do that.
Why was this a job for CID rather than for the uniformed response officers?
I don't think it was particularly a job for the CID, other than we had gone along to try and explain probably better. We are probably more involved in more serious crimes, so we've probably got a better understanding of crime scenes and things like that. But it wasn't particularly a CID job per se. It was just that myself and DC Petrie were available. They were looking for assistance, so we went along to assist.
So as far as you were concerned, you were going along to assist or lend a hand, and you've explained to us this morning that this was about explaining and persuading and reassuring.
Yes.
You explain in your statement that when you actually got there, you discovered that Response were looking for you to take the lead. What did you mean by that?
Just that they had sort of backed off from it and had handed the situation over to ourselves, type thing. So they had basically asked us to you know, speak to the family and see what we could do to resolve the situation.
Let me ask you some questions then about what happened when you and your colleague arrived at Zahid's home address. You explain in your statement that there were officers outside and that you were directed to the back door. That's at paragraph 29 of your statement. And at paragraph 32, you clarify that there were 2 or 3 officers there. Let's perhaps look at this juncture at the scene entry log, which is PS 18504. If we could scroll through the document, please, and go to the next page. Sorry, if we can just get our bearings by looking at this page. So it's a scene entry log. It relates to the Zahid home address, and the log was commenced at 1:30 on the 3rd of May of 2015. If we can perhaps scroll to what I think is page 9 of the PDF. If we can take a moment just to make ourselves familiar with the way that information is recorded in these logs, we see a number of columns with headings along the top: time, date, in and logist details, name and designation, reason for entry, cross-contamination, protective clothing worn, signature, time, date, out and logist details. And do we see here that the log has been commenced at 1:30 in the afternoon by PC Fraser?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
Who's given reason for entry, secure locus / locus protect. The signature has been redacted, but it would appear that he has been at the property on locus protection until 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yes.
Immediately beneath that entry, do we see that Constable Fraser was accompanied by Constable Aitken. They appear to have arrived at the same time, presumably together, with the same purpose: secure locus protection. And do we see that Constable Aitken also appears to have moved away from the locus at 3 o'clock in the afternoon?
Yes.
Do we also see that you and DC Petrie arrived about 10 minutes later, 13:40 hours?
Yep, that's correct, yes.
And if we look at the bottom entry, please, Gordon Miller, is that your handwriting?
It is, yes. It's not very good, but it's my handwriting, yeah.
And you've used little dash marks that I think are intended to indicate that the information in the box above applies equally to your entries, is that right?
That's right, yes.
So instead of putting in the date and the time, you've put little dash marks, but should we understand that you arrived with Constable Petrie at 13:40 on the 3rd of the 5th, 2015?
Yes, that's correct.
And again, under the column reason for entry, you've put little dash marks immediately below Constable Petrie's entry, which was to secure locus. Was that also your stated purpose in
Yes.
going to the property? We see that your signature has been redacted, and I'm afraid that the time date out has also been completely redacted, so we don't appear to have a record on this version of the scene entry log as to when you left, although it appears that Detective Constable Petrie left at 14:45 hours.
Yeah, we would have left at the same time.
Would have left at
Yeah.
the same time. Okay. Can you confirm for me that at the point that you arrived, you and DC Petrie were the only plain-clothed officers present?
That's correct, yes.
And in fact, the only other officers present at all were Constables Fraser and Aitken?
As far as I'm aware, I can't recall but entirely, but certainly myself and DC Petrie were the only plainclothes officers there.
And if there had been any other uniformed officers present aside from Constable Fraser and Constable Aitken, would you have expected that to be recorded in the scene entry log?
The only if they were going inside. If they were outside, potentially they wouldn't have recorded because it's who's entering the scene, obviously.
And what is the boundary of the scene? Is it the front path? Is it the front door?
Every scene's different, but in that case it was the actual house and the car, which we found out later on.
So if, for example, there had been other officers standing on the roadway outside, they wouldn't necessarily have recorded their details in the scene entry log?
That's correct. They'd be outside the perimeter.
But to the best of your recollection, were there any other uniformed officers there aside from Constable Fraser and Constable Aitken?
As far as I'm aware, that's all that was there, yes.
Can we return to your statement, please, your inquiry statement? And can we look at paragraph 30? I'm asked what was the extent of my knowledge about the property before attending and whether the uniformed officers who initially attended had communicated any information to me. We spoke to the officers outside just before we went in. The conversation that we would have had would just be several seconds. It would be half a minute or something like that. I think they told us at that time that there was a disabled man, the kids were there, and there was an older lady as well. I don't think they had the full information at that time, but it was far from being empty, and they also told us that they were not particularly happy as well. They weren't aggressive or anything like that. They were annoyed, upset annoyed, rather than upset emotional, which is understandable. So you record here in your statement that on arrival, the uniformed officers told you that there was a disabled man and kids and an older lady, and that they weren't particularly happy. So that's information that you got when you arrived at this address from the uniformed officers who were already there.
Yes, that's correct.
What, if anything, were you told about the nature of the man's disability?
I think we were just told at that stage that he was in a chair, but it was more the fact that everybody was annoyed and unwilling to leave the address. So,
When you say a chair, do you mean a wheelchair?
yes, sorry, yes.
You say it was more about the fact that everyone was annoyed and unwilling to leave. Should we understand then that the uniformed officers had already attempted to encourage the occupants to leave before you arrived?
Yes, yeah, I think they had some of the details, if I recall correctly.
But certainly the information that you were provided was that they were annoyed and not happy about the request that
That's
they leave.
correct, yes.
Let's look at paragraph 32, please. I'm asked if I recall how many officers were already there when I arrived at the address. There was either 2 or 3. I think maybe the front door was locked and they were round the back. I can't remember why. We certainly went in the back door. I seem to think that there was somebody inside because when we chapped the door, I think it was an officer that let us in rather than Mrs. Rashid, but it's difficult to say. Normally you'd have somebody at the front, somebody at the back, and if occupants were in, you'd definitely have somebody inside just to try and control that as best you could. That's as best as I can recall that bit, unfortunately. So I want to ask you some questions about what you see here. We've looked at the scene entry log and we know that the uniformed officers who were at the address were Constable Fraser and Constable Aitken. Do you recall who it was that you spoke to?
No, I don't. I didn't know these officers. DC Peatley knew them, but I didn't know them.
Okay. We know that Constable Fraser was a male officer and we've heard that Constable Aitken was a female officer. Does that help?
It does, yes. Yeah. It was a male officer that was at the back door.
You say in paragraph 32, I think it was an officer that let us in rather than Mrs. Rashid, but it's difficult to say. And if we can hold that thought and quickly jump to paragraph 35, please. You say here, we chapped the door and I can't remember if it was Mrs. Rashid or there was an officer that initially let us in from the inside. But we were invited in anyway and it was Mrs. Rashid that spoke to us. So in your statement, in both paragraphs 32 and 35, you seem unsure as to who let you into the house, whether it was an officer or whether it was Mrs. Rashid. Now, you've had time to reflect, and I wonder, what's your best recollection today as to who let you into the house?
I don't recall exactly. I've got a memory of us being at the back door, speaking to an officer. Whether they've opened the door and introduced us, or Mrs. Rashid opened the door, I don't honestly recall. But certainly that's how I remember it anyway.
We can look at paragraph 34, please. You say here that you were in the kitchen area and there was another officer in with you as well. Was that one of the officers that you've already referred to, one who was present when you arrived?
Yes, that's how I recall it. There was either they've gone in and introduced us, excuse me, or they've been in and let us in.
And do you recall whether that was a male officer or a female officer?
It was a male officer, as far as I recall.
You said earlier in your evidence that if anyone went into the house, you would expect that to be recorded in the scene entry log.
Yes.
And the only uniformed officers recorded as being present at that time were Constable Fraser and Constable Aitken.
Mm-hmm.
And Constable Aitken, we know, was a female officer. So would it be reasonable perhaps to assume that it was Constable Fraser who was in the house with you?
Yes, that's more than reasonable, yes.
I want to ask you some questions about Constable Fraser. He has already given evidence, and he said that he considered that his role was to silently vouch for the CID officers. He said that he was there to show his presence, to reassure that these two in business dress are police as well. Although they had warrant cards and whatnot, it's often easier and quicker to display myself or a uniformed officer with them. And he said that he didn't carry out any purpose other than to silently vouch for the CID, and that his presence would show that you were with him. I wondered if I could invite your comment on that.
I don't know what to say. I don't know how somebody would silently vouch for us. I mean, if we were, first thing we would do if we were going in a property, we will carry our warrant cards, obviously. We would identify ourselves and give our names straight off the bat and introduce ourselves. So the person that we're speaking to would know exactly who we were. I do know that he was there, so if he's feeling that he's vouching for us, that's fair enough, but it's not something I really think would have been necessary.
So you weren't conscious at the time that he was trying by his uniformed presence to make it clear to the occupiers that you and DC Petrie, although in plain clothes, were also police officers?
I wasn't aware of that, to be honest.
And is this something familiar to you, what I've described? Have you ever been in a situation before where uniformed officers have attended an address with you to offer some sort of reassurance by virtue of the fact that they're in uniform?
No, I've never had that. I've been asked for, whilst I've been in uniform duties, to show my warrant card myself to prove I'm a police officer, but on the other side of things, I've never had that. As I say, we routinely carry our warrant cards and it's there to display. So.
Okay, so it wouldn't be routine for uniformed officers to vouch for plainclothes officers?
No, not that I'm aware of anyway, no.
Constable Fraser also gave evidence that the occupants were perhaps in a sitting room or a living room within the house. He said there was a disabled male in the far corner, possibly a lady standing, and the rest were sitting, possibly on couches. And he was asked, thinking of that answer, if there were couches, do you think maybe the room might have been a living room rather than a kitchen? And he said, could be. Do you, for your part, have any recollection as to where you were? You say in paragraph 34 we were in the kitchen area. Do you recall whether you were in the kitchen at all times, or were you at any time in a living room?
The way I recall what was it was a sort of the kitchen had a sort of dining area. I'm sure there was a dining table there as well, and then further on was the living room. I don't know if it was separate or if it was sort of an small archway through to it type thing. I don't honestly recall, but it seemed to be combined, if you like. It was all one sort of living space, separated obviously by an archway of some kind.
And you were in that living space?
Yes, predominantly I was standing, in between, if you like.
In the archway?
Yeah, just at the side. There was a door or a ramp that went off to the left-hand side where Abid's bedroom and that was, because he was using his chair to go down there. And then, as I say, that was to the left, and then directly behind me would have been the living area with the kitchen in front, and the back door at the side at the back of the kitchen.
Can we look at paragraph 35, please? We looked at the beginning of this already. We chapped the door, and I can't remember if it was Mrs. Rashid or there was an officer that initially let us in from inside, but we were invited in anyway, and it was Mrs. Rashid that spoke to us. Immediately, she started asking us questions, what was going on, all the rest of it. We tried to explain what was happening and the need to take it. She was wondering why we were allowed in without a warrant, so we tried to explain that to her, that, yes, sometimes you do need warrants, but on this occasion, because it was a serious incident that happened at the time the property had been seized, we've got to protect the forensic integrity of it. And at 36, I'm asked if it is my recollection that we were invited into the property. It is. I want to ask you some questions about these paragraphs, Sergeant. So you say that you were invited in, although you don't now recall whether it was an officer or Mrs. Rashid who came to the door. Can you explain to us what you mean by invited in?
Just well, as I say, we entered the property, whether Mrs. Rashid opened the door for us or whether the officer trapped the door and we went in to speak to her. So we weren't told to get out or anything like that. We just entered the property to speak to her. And immediately when we got in, she was clearly annoyed at having been asked to leave her property.
Okay. So if you were invited in by another officer, what would be your authority for going into the house?
We were just through common law powers. We were going in. We were following an instruction from the SIO to seize the property.
If you had been invited in by Mrs. Rashid, what would have been your authority for going into the house?
If we were invited in by her, just we were invited in to speak to her.
You say at paragraph 35, she was wondering why we were allowed in without a warrant. I'm wondering, is that a question she would have asked you if she had invited you in?
Her question was more about us seizing the property. Why could we take the property without a warrant, rather than that's what I'm meaning there.
Okay, these are your words, this is your statement.
Mm-hmm.
And you've told us that you did your best to be truthful and accurate when you gave the statement, and you signed every page. And the words that you have used here were, she was wondering why we were allowed in without a warrant.
Yes. Well, as I say, the conversation that we had with her was along the lines of why we were taking the property. Said they needed a warrant. That's what I was meaning there.
Okay. Did she ask you why you were allowed in without a warrant?
Not that I recall.
You explain in your statement, we tried to explain to her that yes, sometimes you do need warrants, but on this occasion, because it was a serious incident that happened at that time, the property had been seized, we've got to protect the forensic integrity of it. What was the serious incident that had happened?
Obviously the incident that happened in Kirkcaldy with Sheku, at that time they were aware that Saeed had left prior to Sheku going down Hayfield Road and had come back to the address in Methil.
Did you have that information at that time?
I don't know at that exact time, but certainly during the time we were in the property, we would have had that information, yes.
So what was the connection then between the incident involving Shekabayo and Saeed's house?
The connection was, certainly I don't know at that exact time if we knew that, but the connection was that they had been taking drugs and we weren't aware whether the drugs were within that house or not.
Is that information that you had at the time?
Sorry?
Was that information that you had at the time?
I don't know. We certainly, DC Petrie had contacted our supervisor, DS Dursley at that time, so he would have been given information whilst we were there when we'd fed back. So I honestly don't know at that exact time if we had that information or not.
Okay. Going back to paragraph 35 of your statement, Mrs. Rashid was wondering why we were allowed in without a warrant. What powers does a police officer have to enter someone's house without a warrant?
They have powers under common law, but generally you would get a warrant to enter a property.
I take it there wasn't a warrant on this occasion.
Not at that stage, no.
Okay. And what power does a police officer have to seize a house for the purposes of a search without a warrant?
Again, under common law powers, if it's an integral part of the investigation, which the SIO had deemed it was, they had seized that property to presumably search it.
So you say there are common law powers that would allow an officer to enter a house without a warrant and would allow an officer to seize a house for the purposes of a search without a warrant. Did I understand your position correctly?
Yes.
Okay. And you say that those circumstances were met here because the SIO had said the property was an integral part of the investigation. Is that right?
Yes, they had said they wanted it seized.
Did you know why the SIO wanted it seized?
No, I don't think so. Not at that stage.
So at that stage then you didn't know what the connection was between the death of Chef Bayo and this property?
Initially when we entered the property we didn't, or certainly I didn't know.
But it's your understanding that where an SIO says that an address is an integral part of an inquiry, then that gives you the power at common law to enter an address and seize that address without a warrant.
Yeah, well, we were basically following a lawful order from the SIO.
Can we have a look at paragraph 99, please? I'm asked what was my understanding when I went to Zahid's address of what our authority was for seizing the property. My understanding was that the decision had been made by the SIO that it was to be seized. That message was broadcast, but in an ideal world we would have occupants allowing us to take the property. I think because it had gotten to the stage where they weren't wanting to leave, that they had to seize that potential evidence. So that was done under the instructions of the SIO. And that's very much what you've just told us in your evidence just now, that you were following a lawful order from the SIO. If we can scroll down to paragraph 100, please. I am asked if it was my understanding that a warrant was not needed to seize the property because a decision had been made at a senior level that this was a place of interest and that was the reason that we were seizing the property. That's right. If there was a need for a warrant, it would have been obtained retrospectively and senior management would have made that decision. Because it was an incident that was fluid and was kind of ongoing, and they weren't aware of what's happened, they had made that decision to seize the property. We did that on the instructions of the SIO, and if they decided they needed a warrant to search the property, which I think they would, that's a decision for the SIO. When they were having their silver meetings or tactical meetings, somebody would have applied for a warrant retrospectively, so regardless, the outcome would be the same. I want to ask you some questions about this. So your evidence is that you were following a lawful order from the SIO who had said the property was to be seized, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And that lawful order, you say, gave you a common law power to enter the property and seize the property?
Yes.
So just to be clear, your evidence is that because a decision had been taken at a senior level by the SIO that the property was to be seized, there was no need for a warrant.
Well, to search it, there could be a need for a warrant, but I mean, we're seizing the property at that time to protect the forensic integrity of it. So if there was drugs within the property, they couldn't be disposed of or anything like that. And then ultimately, retrospectively, if they would, during their meetings, we'd decide whether they were going to apply for warrants to search the property.
Okay. And you say in this statement that a warrant could be sought retrospectively. What's the process for that?
Well, for a search warrant, the process would be that they would apply to the Procurator Fiscal, who would then make contact with the Sheriff and set up an appointment to get a warrant.
Okay. And what information would need to be given to the Sheriff before the Sheriff would grant a warrant?
In this case, I take
In
it up,
general?
just in general, well, usually if it was drugs, it would be information, intelligence that was available, information that was available, and because it's their job to make sure that we're not infringing human rights, if you like, as far as that goes.
Okay. And what would a sheriff do if they weren't satisfied that the information was up to standard?
They wouldn't authorise a warrant.
Now, can I just be clear when you say that a warrant could have been sought retrospectively? What exactly do you mean by retrospectively?
Well, after the property has been seized, because it's to be seized to ensure the integrity of it so nothing gets displaced or disposed of, they could then apply for a warrant, a search warrant, to the Procurator Fiscal in order to ensure that it was legally binding. Because if you've got somebody within a property that are unwilling or uncooperative because the family did begrudgingly leave the address, they weren't happy, I would have presumed that they would have got a warrant just to make sure that if anything was discovered that was a pertinent part of the investigation, that it would be obtained legally, if you like.
So when you say retrospectively, do you mean after the property has been seized but before a search was carried out? Or
Yes.
do you mean after the search was carried
No,
out?
but before the search. But again, that's down to the investigation. It's down to them to decide. But certainly I would have thought they would have considered that.
Okay. So we've spoken about instructions from a senior officer, common law powers, and warrants. You haven't mentioned consent at all for as the basis for seizing a property.
No, I haven't. I mean, ultimately, usually if people consent to search them, they're quite happy about it. And I know sometimes I'll sign a notebook and things like that to say that they're happy. But the family, excuse me, the family were clearly unhappy about us being within the address, and particularly unhappy about having to leave the address. That was the real issue.
You say the family were unhappy that the police were in their address.
Yes.
Okay. So should we understand from that that the family had not given consent for the police to be in their house?
Certainly, yeah. You could say that. I mean, we didn't enter the house and were asked to leave or anything like that, but they were unhappy about the police being in the address, and they were unhappy about having to leave the address. And not so much the search, we didn't discuss a search or anything like that, but certainly predominantly they were unhappy about having to leave the address.
Okay. A number of more senior officers have given evidence about the circumstances in which you can seize a property, and I'd like to put some of that evidence to you for your comment. Sergeant Dursley, in his inquiry statement, we don't need this on the screen, but just for reference, it's SBPI 00228, paragraphs 131 and 154, said that he assumed the occupants had consented to the property being seized, as he'd not had any feedback that there was any difficulty, and that if there had been an issue, he would have referred that to the SIO and would be thinking about warrants. Do you want to make any comment on that?
I can't really comment on that. I mean, everything that was happening was fed back to DS Dursley. I believe it was DC Petrie that done the phoning, but they were quite clear. I know Kev, when he phoned them, I mean, he would have given them a full update of exactly the situation that we had, the family members that were there, the fact that they were asking for a warrant. All that information would have been passed back.
Okay. Well, certainly, DS Dursley's evidence was that he assumed that the attending officers had obtained consent, and he would have expected to hear about it if there had been an issue.
Well, as I say, my recollection is he was contacted at least twice from that address, and the information of exactly what was happening. As again, I can't really speak to what was said, because it wasn't me that was doing the phoning, but certainly it was quite clear. We had been asked by Mrs. Rashid and Mr. Ahmed when he come along about a warrant. It was quite clear that they weren't consenting to a search of the property.
Let me tell you what Gary McEwen said in his evidence. He said that to go for a warrant, you have to stipulate on the warrant predominantly what it is you're going there for, what purpose. And at that early stage, I'm not sure that level of information and detail would have been known. He was asked, so they may not have been in a position to secure a warrant because they couldn't have all the details. And he said, perhaps not. So you were very much dependent on consent being given. And he said, yes. So he too suggested that he understood that consent was the basis upon which the property was being seized. Do you have any comment to make on his evidence?
No, not particularly. As I say, the family were clearly unhappy, and that was relayed back to them. Eventually, when they did leave, it was quite clear that the main aspect was trying to get back into the property for a beat for the evening.
We also heard from Pat Campbell, the SIO. He gave evidence that he understood that common law powers had been used to seize the property, and that the property was to be searched on the basis of the occupier's consent. And he also gave evidence that if consent had not been obtained, then he would have sought a warrant. Do you have any comment on that?
I don't know where why they thought consent had been given. I mean, it was at the stage, we've not even asked anybody to sign a notebook to consent to searching addresses or anything like that. It would have been pointless asking, so I don't know. It must have just been a breakdown in communications, but as I said, we had fed back that the family were quite unhappy about having to leave the address, so why they've thought that they were consenting to a search, I don't know. You'd have to ask them that.
Finally, can I tell you about the evidence given by Stuart Hewliston, crime scene coordinator, sorry, not oral evidence, but in an inquiry statement. Again, we don't need this on the screen, but for reference, it's SBPI 00214 at paragraph 266. I have been told the occupier's position is that no permission was given for the police to secure the property and that a complaint was made. I wasn't aware of this. I would dispute that they said they didn't give permission. If we didn't have permission, then we'd stay there until we had a warrant. Again, do you have any comment to make on that?
Yes, again, if somebody's unwilling, I would think it would be a matter of course that you would apply for a warrant.
Just to be clear, are you saying that if someone is unwilling to let you seize the property, you would apply for a warrant, or if someone is unwilling to let you search the property, you would apply for a warrant, or both?
To search the property, obviously, they're deemed the need to seize the property there and then, just to protect the forensic integrity of anything that was within the address.
You mentioned once or twice notebooks and signing notebooks. What were you referring to?
It's practice. I don't know if it was practice at that time, it's that long ago, but certainly if you were looking to search something and somebody was willingly accepting you do that, we would get an entry in our notebook and ask them to sign that. So there was a record to say that they were consenting to that search.
And would you also do that if someone was consenting to you coming into their house and seizing their house?
No, it's not something I've ever done before or since.
Okay. Can I tell you about the evidence that we've heard from another constable, a DC Finch? He gave evidence that when an occupier grants permission for their home to be seized, he would record that so that there couldn't be any dispute about that in the future. He said, I can tell you how I would capture such permission. I would build that within the witness statement. I'd make it clear that we've explained that they're under no obligation to do so. It's been explained why, you know the purpose of doing it and what we're looking to achieve, and the fact that if they become uncomfortable at any point, they can withdraw that permission. And I would capture that within the body of a signed statement from that witness. He went on to say that if the statement was being taken at a later point in time, he would capture that by means of a paragraph within his notebook, and he would ask the witness to sign it to make clear they understood they were under no obligation to allow him to seize the property. That's how he would approach matters, and he was asked why that was his practice, and he said, to withstand future scrutiny, that we've demonstrated a level of fairness and explanation to the witness. And can I invite your views on that? Because your practice seems to be different. You suggest that you might record consent to a search in a notebook, but you wouldn't record consent to entering and seizing someone's home.
Yeah, well, certainly that's best practice, what's been described there, but we haven't actually seized the property from witnesses before or since, so certainly I haven't. Especially a secondary crime scene. So, as I say, as far as I was concerned, the property had already been seized by the officers that were there. We went along to try and explain the situation and the need, you know, to do that. And it was, as I said all along, it was quite clear the family were quite unhappy with him to leave the property.
You say that Constable Finch's practice, as described by him in his evidence, is best practice, albeit it's not a practice that you necessarily follow yourself.
Yeah, definitely. But as I say, that's what you're referring to there is somebody that's quite happy and willing for a search and that to happen. That wasn't really the case when we were there. I mean, they were clearly unhappy.
You said earlier in your evidence that you had gone along to explain and persuade and reassure the occupants. As part of your attempts to explain and persuade and reassure, did it occur to you to ask them for permission, try to bring them with you in that way?
No, it didn't, because they were clearly unhappy. And that wasn't a question that was asked, because, as I say, the family were unhappy that the police were there. They were unhappy about having to leave the address. So I never once considered asking them to consent, because it wasn't a question that was going to be willingly received, if you like.
Would you do anything differently now if the same situation arose tomorrow?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you reflect on everything that you do, and certainly I think the key factor was that they weren't able to provide information. They had no idea why they were there, so they were quite rightly unhappy of why we were there. If we were able to tell them and explain the connection with the property and the need to do it and the need to search it, I think it would have probably been better. But as I say, the time we got there, Mrs. Rashid and her family members were annoyed before we even arrived, so it was quite difficult.
Can we look at Mrs. Rashid's inquiry statement, please? It's SBPI 00260. Can we look at paragraph 3, please? Sorry, can we scroll down a little? I think I've recorded the wrong paragraph number. Keep scrolling, please. Okay. If we can just pause there. I'd like to read you an extract from her statement. I seem to have misplaced the paragraph number, but I'll check that over the break and we can confirm the paragraph number for you. But for now, to allow us to move on, I'll simply read it out if you don't mind. A man in a suit was banging on the back door. He was quite tall and broad, maybe in his 40s. I think he had a moustache or some kind of facial hair. I opened the door and he told me we needed to vacate the property. I told him we wouldn't unless they had a warrant. He was very abrupt and quite rude and said they didn't need a warrant to come into the house. I was frightened and scared and didn't know what to do. I remember closing the door and he went away. Then he came back and there were more of them. He knocked again. I opened the door. Thank you. We're in paragraph 4. Thank you. I'm reading it slightly short. He knocked again. I opened the door. He was with another man in a suit who looked younger. They said they didn't need a warrant and that we had to vacate the house now. They said we didn't have a choice and had to let them in because it was to do with the evidence and they had to search the house. It's a long paragraph, so I've read it slightly short. And we have it on the screen in front of us now. And I wanted to ask some questions about that. We've already looked at the scene entry log. I don't think we need to pull that up on the screen again. But I think we were able to see from that the scene entry log that the only people who were at the locus before you and Constable Petrie left at 2:45 in the afternoon were yourself, DC Petrie, PC Fraser and PC Aitken. You're nodding. Do you recall seeing that in the scene entry log? We can bring it up again if that would be helpful. So there were only 4 people within the house, and you've explained to us that officers who were standing perhaps on the path or the roadway outside, their details might not have been recorded, but anyone who went into their house, their details ought to have been recorded. So, as we've discussed already, Constable Aitken is a woman, and only yourself and DC Petrie were wearing suits. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Okay. And Mrs. Rashid describes a man in a suit banging on the back door, quite tall and broad, maybe in his 40s. I think he had a moustache or some kind of facial hair. I opened the door and he told me we needed to vacate the property. I told him we wouldn't unless they had a warrant. So only you and Constable Petrie were wearing suits, and you are, how tall are you?
5'11".
5'11", and how tall is DC Petrie?
I think he'll be 6 foot.
So he's also tall?
Yeah.
Okay. How old is Constable Petrie?
I think he'll be about 45 or something now.
If I told you his date of birth was 1981, and your date of birth is which year?
69.
69, so you're a little bit older than him. Did you have facial hair at the time?
No.
You didn't. Did Constable Petrie?
No.
Mrs. Rashid certainly describes this man in a suit as tall, maybe about 6 foot, and broad. And you describe yourself in your statement, we don't need to go to it, but it's a paragraph 37, as stout. And I wonder whether Mrs. Rashid appears to be describing you here.
No, that certainly wasn't that. Can I, excuse me, can I just ask, was there a bit further on, just before that, did it say somebody had gone to the door looking for the brother? Is that correct?
Let's check. Let's scroll back up. Paragraph 3, the police came to the door asking for my brother Zahid. I told them he wasn't at home. I asked what it was about, but they didn't say anything. They said it was fine. They asked what time he would be home. I hadn't seen him all night and didn't know where he was. They went away. I think my mum was maybe in the bathroom at that point, and someone was still in bed, but I'm not sure. And then around an hour's time, lots of officers came to the house. I couldn't count how many. A man in a suit was banging on the back door. He was quite tall and broad, maybe in his 40s.
I would suggest, and I don't know if this is correct or not, that where was Saeed picked up about? If we go back to the...
Well, I don't want to get
No, I
drawn
know,
into...
but what I'm suggesting is that isn't me and DC Petrie. That's an incident that's happened before we've got there, I would suggest. Because we certainly didn't bang on any doors as described.
Well, let's look in more detail at paragraph 4 to see if we can be clear about whether she's describing something that happened earlier or something that happened at the time that you were at the property. She does say around an hour's time. I think that should perhaps read an hour's time later. But she describes, if we can go back to paragraph 3, please, the officers who came looking for Zahid going away, and then in an hour's time, more officers coming to the house. A man in the suit was banging on the door, tall and broad, maybe in his 40s. I opened the door and he told me we needed to vacate the property for an investigation. Other officers in the garden seemed to be waiting for the go-ahead to come in. The officer in the suit said they didn't need to disclose any information and that we needed to vacate the house. I told him we wouldn't unless they had a warrant. He was very pushy, abrupt and quite rude. I felt really intimidated by him. I was frightened and scared and didn't know what to do. I can't remember what else I said to him. I remember closing the door and he went away, and I could see him walking down to the front of the house. Then he came back and there were more of them. He knocked again. I opened the door. He was with another man in a suit who looked younger. They said they didn't need a warrant and that we had to vacate the house now. They said we didn't have a choice and had to let them in because this was a crime scene and they needed to seal the house and they had to search the house.
That I can tell you quite right here and now, that isn't me and DC Petrie. There's obviously been other people at that address. If that's how Mrs. Rashid recalls it, because we went straight into the property and we remained in the property. She's talking about people coming out of the property, going back round and things like that, and we certainly weren't rude or anything like that. So I don't, you'd obviously have to ask her exactly what it is, but that isn't me and DC Petre that is being described there. I would suggest that that's been earlier before we've gotten there. That is prior to the radio message that's gone saying that the property is to be seized, is how I would suggest that paragraph sits.
All right, well, let's read on to see if that might shed any light as to when in time this happened. If we can go to the next paragraph, please. She explains, I told them we couldn't do that. I had to speak to my dad as I have a disabled brother. I explained to them that he can't walk, he needs support to move around and get into a vehicle. I told them I couldn't do that on my own because I was looking after my children and not strong enough. If we keep going, just to get the flavour of her statement. I can't remember what they said. I remember when I said I had to contact my dad, they said they couldn't allow anyone into the house. I told them I couldn't drive, and very little space. I told them I needed to phone my brother. There's a conversation about that. If we can scroll down a little bit further, please. So this seems to be, I'm going through this quite quickly, Sergeant, but it seems to be her position that officers came to the house looking for her brother. They went away. An hour later, other officers came back and plainclothes officers knocked at the door. And then she describes what happens after that. And she describes at paragraph 9, the tall officer forcing himself into the house. He walked into the house, pushing me towards the sitting room because as he walked towards me, I had to walk backwards. He came through the kitchen and stood in the sitting room. I was panicked at this stage. I was worried about the safety of my children, my disabled brother, and my elderly mum. And I was suffering from something which added to this fear. So she describes here the tall officer, who I think is the one she described as being in plain clothes, forcing himself into the house. And we'll look at the language used there later. But for present purposes, she describes that officer coming into the house. And we do know, because it's your evidence, I think, that you did go into the house.
That's correct, yes.
And
yeah.
we do have a scene entry log that has, records who has gone into the house. So although you may take issue with the detail of Mrs. Rashid's evidence, would you accept or not that she appears to be describing, in the paragraphs that we've looked at, the moment that yourself and Constable Petrie, and perhaps also the uniformed officers, arrived at her property?
Yes, at that bit, what she's describing before isn't anything that me and DC Petrie did. As I said, we went straight into the property. We didn't bang at the door and go away and come back. We went to the back door, spoke to the officer at the back door briefly, and then entered the property.
Okay. So if we can scroll back up, I think we began at paragraph 4 of her statement, just so I can be clear what you accept and what you dispute. So you were wearing a suit, but you say we're not banging on the door? Is that right?
Yeah, she's describing somebody having a moustache or facial hair. That's not me or DC Petrie either.
That's not you. Let's just go through this line by line. She also says he was quite tall and broad. You're 5'11", and would you describe yourself as broad? I think you used the word stout in your statement. Would tall and broad be fair?
Well, yes, but as I was saying, most people would, if they were being kind, would describe me as being stout. Yeah.
All right, and in your 40s at that point in
I
time?
would have been, yeah.
Okay. You say you didn't have a moustache or facial hair, nor did DC Petrie. I opened the door and he told me we needed to vacate the property for an investigation. Did you say to Mrs. Rashid that she and her family needed to vacate the property for an investigation?
Not at the door.
No.
Not as that's described. Certainly we did when we were within the house.
Okay. Lots of other officers were standing in the garden. Do you have a comment on that?
As I say, I don't know where these officers have... There couldn't have been lots of officers standing in the garden.
Okay. Let's move on then to the officer in the suit said they didn't need to disclose any information and that we needed to vacate the house. Is that something that you would have said?
But, yes, I think I'm asked about that in my statement. We wouldn't say we wouldn't disclose. We maybe would have said we couldn't disclose information. Again, going back to the integrity of the...
Okay. I told him we wouldn't unless they had a warrant.
Yeah, she did ask for a warrant. And I know it says there that we were pushy, abrupt and quite rude. At that stage, because the family are so unhappy, we're expecting a police complaint to come in. You know, when people are unhappy, they're going to be complaining. So we certainly weren't rude or pushy in any way, shape or form. I can assure you that, because in these situations when people are likely to complain about you, you're careful of your terminology and your body language and what you're saying and how you're acting, just to ensure that it's not construed incorrectly.
So you take issue with that description of the way that you presented yourself. She goes on to say she felt intimidated, frightened and scared. She says, I remember closing the door and he went away and I could see him walking down to the front of the house, then he came back and there were more of them. Did you at any point walk to the front and then return to the back?
No, we went in. This is what I'm saying. I don't know if this is from earlier or what, because we entered the property and we stayed within the property until we left. We never exited it at all. In fact, the only time we did exit it was just shortly before she left to move the car. That had been left there because it was blocking them in, her vehicle in.
Okay. In any event, she says, he knocked again, I opened the door, he was with another man in a suit who looked younger, and I think you've said DC Petrie was younger than you. They said they didn't need a warrant and we had to vacate the house now. They said we didn't have a choice and had to let them in because this was a crime scene and they need to seal the house and they had to search the house. Did you say those things to Mrs. Rashid?
Yes, we would have said something similar to that whilst we were within the house, when we were trying to explain the reason for the police being there and you know what was going to be happening.
So although there may be differences between you in terms of whether you knocked at the door, whether that was once or twice, whether there were people standing in the garden, whether you were pushy, abrupt and rude, and so on, would it appear to you, Sergeant, that she is in fact describing the same incident, the occasion on which you and DC Petrie went to her door?
Yeah, I agree with some of it, whether... As I say, I don't know if there's been officers there beforehand and it's mixed together. I don't know. But certainly, yes, what she's mentioned is right enough about her saying that the need for the warrant and they're not wanting to vacate the house.
And we've gone through this paragraph to clarify exactly where the differences lie between you.
Yes, yeah.
Perhaps we can look at paragraph 4 of her statement. Are we on paragraph 4?
Could I take a quick comfort break, if that's all right? Just with
Well, I think that's well timed,
We usually
Sergeant.
have a break at 7:30.
All right,
So take
perfect.
a break now for 20 minutes.
Thank you. Sorry, it's just all this water.
Miss Thompson.
Thank you, sir. Can we go back to your inquiry statement, please? And I'd like to take you to paragraph 39. You say paragraph 39, Mrs. Rashid was clearly upset, not emotionally upset, but annoyed that she was being asked to vacate her household, and they left, albeit begrudgingly, which I fully understand. There was a conversation back and forward. We were trying to explain the process to her. She'd asked for a warrant. It was explained that we didn't need a warrant, that it was an ongoing investigation, and that the SIO had made the decision to seize it. So you've already given evidence that as far as you understand things, where the SIO has given an instruction that a property is to be seized, and you have a common law power to seize that property. But here in this paragraph, you describe Mrs. Rashid being asked to leave, and the family leaving begrudgingly. And they had asked for a warrant. You tried to explain the process to her. Can you help us to understand, seizure of a property is one thing, but here you're asking the occupiers to actually leave the property. What's your authority, your lawful authority for doing that?
Excuse me. It wasn't so much lawful authority. We tried to explain about the need for the forensic integrity of the property, you know, that there was people within it in order to seize it and secure it, that we would need them to vacate. So we had a long conversation backwards and forwards with her about that, and that's really, it was a long discussion as far as that goes.
But I'm not sure that I understand your evidence as to what your authority was to get these people out of their house.
There wasn't. We were trying to persuade them to leave the house so we could, so it could be contained and searched later on.
When you say you were trying to persuade them, do you mean you were trying to obtain their consent?
To an extent, yes. We were asking them to leave, as I had said, because we were needed to protect the integrity of the address.
Did you have any power to force them to leave?
Not particularly that I'm aware of. I mean, if they'd refused to leave indefinitely, we would have fed that back in. Basically, and it would be at that stage I would think you'd be needing to get a warrant to seize it.
Okay, so you're not aware of a power that would allow you to force someone out of their own home?
Not. I mean, obviously, all the family members were just not directly involved. They were witnesses, so it wasn't normal in an address. It's usually it would be somebody that would be directly involved, and you would have other police powers to maybe detain them, to take them, to interview them and things like that. But certainly not that wasn't the case as far as that goes.
There was no power that you were aware of that would have allowed you to force this family onto the street if they had refused to leave?
Yes, we wouldn't force them out into the street, but yes.
So if you didn't have a power to force them to leave, does it not follow that you were relying on their goodwill, their cooperation, their consent?
Yes. Yeah, we were.
Would it also follow that they did not have to consent to leaving their home?
That's correct as well, yes. I suppose technically they wouldn't have to consent, it's their address.
Mm-hmm. And what steps did you take to make sure they understood that they didn't have to consent to leaving their home?
I don't know. I don't recall if I took any steps as far as that goes.
And what steps did you take to record their understanding and their consent?
I didn't, as I said, I didn't record anything like that. We knew they were very unhappy and unhappy to be leaving, so it wasn't recorded. It was passed back that they were leaving begrudgingly.
We spoke earlier about making entries in notebooks.
Yes.
Did you make an entry in your notebook?
I think I noted details, but I didn't make an entry as such.
So you didn't, for example, make an entry to the effect that Mrs. Rashid and her family were leaving willingly, that they'd been advised that they weren't duty-bound to leave, but they were leaving of consent, and have Mrs. Rashid sign that?
No, I didn't have anything like that.
Why not?
I didn't think about doing it at that time, and as I said, they weren't consenting as such. They were begrudgingly leaving. They weren't happy about having to leave, and when Mr. Hackmed came along, the conversation was more towards the welfare of Abid, about trying to get him back into the address. That was the main focus, if you like.
You say the family weren't happy, they left begrudgingly. You've also told us that Mrs. Rashid asked for a warrant. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. And she gave evidence on the 8th of February of this year. She was asked, did she feel she had a choice but to leave? And she replied no. She didn't think she had a choice. Do you have any comment on that?
No, not particularly. Obviously, our job was to try and persuade, encourage, whichever way you want to look at it, for the family members to vacate the property so it could be seized, so the forensic integrity could be secured. But certainly that wasn't a conversation I had with her.
Looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight and reflection, do you see why Mrs. Rashid may have felt that she didn't have a choice?
Yes, yeah, I do. I don't fall out with that at all. As I've said all along, if the police came into my property on a Sunday and asked me to vacate, I wouldn't have been happy either.
And again, if you found yourself in this situation tomorrow, is there anything that you might do differently?
Oh, definitely. We would make sure the family members were fully aware of their rights. Would make sure that they were given more information than what they were given.
And would you make sure that they understood that they didn't have to leave and that you were asking them to do that of consent?
Yes, I would do. I'd make sure that was the case.
And would you get them to sign a note to that effect in your notebook?
Definitely. If they were leaving and they were providing consent, yeah, I would definitely do that. I don't know back at that time if that was something that we done, but certainly it's common practice nowadays to do that.
And what would be the advantages of doing that?
Just obviously that you're recording the fact that they're agreeing to what you're asking them to do, that there's an actual record of it.
Do you recall how long you were within the family home?
I reckon it must have been the best part of an hour in total.
I think when we looked at the scene entry log, we don't need to bring it up on the screen again, but it records you arriving at 13:40 and leaving at 14:45, so just over an hour at most.
Yeah, that'd be right.
In fact, I wonder if we can bring it back up again, the scene entry log, please. And if we can look at page 9. So your entry is the entry at the very bottom there. As we discussed earlier, you've used little dash marks to replicate the information recorded in the entry above. So it effectively reads as 1340, 3rd May 2015, Gordon Miller, secure locus. Can I ask why it doesn't say there that you went into the house?
I think I think maybe the scene log wasn't started at that time. I don't know, to be honest. Are you meaning? I'm not quite sure what you mean, actually.
I'm sorry, that's my, if I'm unclear, that's entirely my fault. Well, you've told us that your purpose in going to this property was to explain and persuade and reassure the occupants to leave, and you've told us that you went into the house and spoke with Mrs. Rashid.
Yes.
But the scene entry log says that your reason for entry was to secure the locus.
Yes, that predominantly that's what we were there to do, to speak to the family members in order that the locus could be secured.
I'm just wondering then why there's no reference to you entering the house and speaking with the occupants under the heading reason for entry, why it just says secure locus.
It's not something I would put in. I mean, the overall reason for us being there is to secure the locus. So that the reason for the scene log is just to signpost the times that the officers are in and out of that particular scene, if you like.
Because you can't tell by looking at the scene log that you've been into the property or that you've had any dealings with the occupants.
Well, it says that we're there to secure the locus, so yeah, I understand what you're saying, but it's not something that we would have recorded down there. I mean, the reason is, as I say, it's more a forensic reason than anything to understand who's going in and out of the property.
Okay. Can we look at page 4 of the log, please? Sorry, page 4 of the PDF, please. So we see that this is a pro forma, headed up role of the scene entry logist. The entry log keeper plays a vital role in ensuring the security and integrity of a scene. Where such a serious crime or incident has occurred, the first officer at the scene is responsible for introducing control and arranging the commencement of a scene entry log. The purpose of this log is to exclude everyone from the scene, irrespective of rank or department, until advised by the crime scene manager or the senior investigating officer. The only exception to this may be other emergency services personnel, where it is necessary to preserve life or where there is a requirement to establish that death has occurred. And further down, 4 paragraphs from the bottom of the page, it is the duty of the officer maintaining the scene entry log to ask for identification, deny access if unsure, and to notify the CSM or their supervisor as appropriate. In such circumstances, the officer concerned will be fully supported in their actions. The accurate completion of this log is a crucial part of any serious incident, as it may later be necessary to account for every person who has had access to the scene, the precautions taken to ensure its integrity, and to prevent the potential for cross-contamination of evidence. So I'm just wondering, against the background of the stated purpose of a log of this sort being kept, whether it might have been helpful if the log had recorded that you had gone into the property.
Well, from reading it, it is suggesting that I'm going into that. So, I mean, that signposting that have been there, and that would be further backed up by my statement of exactly what we've done.
Let's go back to the entry, please. It was on page 9, because we have heard evidence that typically, and this was not a typical case because there were people at home, but typically locust protection would involve someone standing at the front, someone standing at the back. No one would actually need to go in.
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
So I'm just wondering how anyone reading this log would know that this wasn't a typical scenario and that there had been more to it than locust protection at the front and rear of the property, and in fact, you'd gone in.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah, that's a fair point. Normally, it's very limited what they put in the reason for entry, whether it's to search or what the reason is. But no, I get that. As I said, we just recorded. We were there to secure the locus. We knew that we had entered the locus, but in hindsight, maybe we should have put down as you described.
And when we looked at page 4, we don't need to go back to it, but when we looked at it a moment ago, there was information about the need to ensure the forensic integrity of the locus and prevent cross-contamination and so on. And again, given that you went into the property, would the very fact that you went into the property create an opportunity for cross-contamination?
Well, everything could be seen as an opportunity, but yes, but we hadn't been anywhere near any other loci or anything like that, so there wasn't a cross-contamination consideration, if you like, but certainly that's something that we do consider.
You weren't wearing a suit?
No.
As in a forensic suit on top of your clothes?
No,
I know you were
what
wearing
mean,
a suit, but not a forensic one.
No.
Or gloves?
No.
A mask? Anything like
No.
that? And at the point in time that you went into the house, you knew very little about the incident. And would it be fair to say you didn't fully appreciate what the relevance of the property might have been?
Yeah, that's fair to say. I think at that stage we thought they would be looking to search the property for either drugs or potentially a bladed article or something like that. But certainly we weren't suited up or anything like that. That would be more if we were going to be actively involved in a search. We would do that.
Okay. And you say you thought it would be drugs or a blade. Was that an assumption on your part, that would be the sort of evidence that would be looked for in due course?
Yes, that was my own assumption, yeah.
We've heard evidence that in actual fact, when a search was carried out, all that was really of interest to the SIO was some clothing. Were you aware of that?
No, I certainly wasn't aware of that, no.
Can we go back to your inquiry statement, please? Can we look at paragraph 34? I'm asked if DC Petrie and I were in close proximity throughout the time we were at the address. Yes, most of the time. I think he maybe removed himself to make a phone call, but yes, we were in the kitchen area, and there was another officer in with us as well. I'm asked if it was one of the 2 or 3 officers to whom I've already referred. It was. I didn't know them, DC Petrie did. He knew who they were, but there weren't any officers that I knew. You say here that you were in the kitchen, and as we discussed previously, there was a sort of a living area. You said there might have been an archway separating the kitchen from the living space.
Yes.
Do you recall how far you went beyond the point of stepping inside the back door?
I was, well, the excuse me, the door was at the sort of far end of the kitchen. So I was past the kitchen and I was standing at the far end of the kitchen, if you like. in between. If I recall correctly, I think it was maybe even a rail where the ramp was going to the left, where Abid's bedroom and that was. So I was standing there most of the time. Mrs. Rashid and her mother were at the dining table, which was in front of me, with the living room at the back of me.
And where was Mrs. Rashid's brother?
Abid was in his chair, and he came through several occasions. He came through in his chair, and he would go back through. They explained, obviously, I think he uses his toilet facilities quite frequently, so he was going backwards and forwards there.
We've heard that Mrs. Rashid's children were in the house. Did you see the children?
I don't remember seeing the children, no.
You say at paragraph 34 that DC Petrie maybe removed himself to make a phone call. How long was he away for?
Several minutes it would have been. I think when we had the family were clearly unhappy and not wanting to leave, he had gone to phone DS Dursley and update him of the situation.
That aside, were you together all of the time that you were in the house?
More or less, yes, as far as I can recall.
And you say that one of the uniformed officers was there too, and I think we've worked out that that must have been Constable Fraser, because Constable Aitken was a lady officer.
Yeah.
What was Constable Aitken doing?
I think, I don't know, I think they must have been outside.
So he wasn't in the house throughout the entire time that you were in the house?
I think for cost purposes here, you asked him about Constable Aitken.
Oh,
I
I'm
think
so
you
sorry.
mean Constable Fraser.
I'm so sorry. Thank you, sir. That was entirely my fault.
No,
I'm sorry for
that's
the
fine.
confusion. I'm getting the two uniformed officers muddled up. So we've heard that Constable Aitken was the lady officer, and
Yes.
you're absolutely right, she was outside.
Yes,
Constable Fraser was the male uniformed officer
yes.
who was in the house.
He was in the kitchen as far as I recall, yeah.
And I'm wondering whether he was in the house throughout the entire time that you were in the house.
I don't know, to be honest. He was certainly there. I do remember. Whether he was there the entire time, I don't know.
And to your knowledge, did either of the other officers, that would be Constable Fraser or DC Petrie, go upstairs at any time?
Not that I'm aware of. I certainly don't recall that.
Can we turn to paragraph 40, please? I'd like to ask you some questions now about information that was provided to Mrs. Rashid and her family. I've been directed to paragraph 4 on page 2 of Mrs. Rashid's statement, in which she states that an officer in a suit said they didn't need to disclose any information and that we needed to vacate the house. It has been explained to me that Mrs. Rashid does not mention in her statement the name of the officer in question. I'm asked if I recall a discussion in those terms with Mrs. Rashid involving either me or DC Petrie. There would be something very similar to that, but we wouldn't say we didn't need to disclose any information. We maybe said that we couldn't disclose information, which is different, obviously, but obviously that's her interpretation of that. Those type of things, until you've got it secured, you're careful of what you're saying. You'd have to manage it. I have no idea even if they found anything in that house or what there was, but yes, I do recall something similar to that. So I want to ask you about this paragraph. You say, we maybe said we couldn't disclose information. Did you say to Mrs. Rashid that you couldn't disclose information?
More than likely, yes, because we were having a conversation of why we were there, what we were looking for, things along those lines. So, yes, the likelihood is I would have said something like that. We couldn't disclose information. For instance, if it was drugs that we were looking for, I wouldn't say that. It's got to be managed information, because until you've got the property secured, somebody could dispose of items that you're potentially looking for. So it was very, very limited information that unfortunately that we were able to provide, which was one of the problems really.
What information did you have that you couldn't disclose?
Well, we didn't know what the real connection with the house. We didn't know what we'd be looking for. We didn't have that information.
So I just want to be clear then whether you had information that you couldn't disclose or whether you didn't have any information to disclose.
It's a bit of both. Sorry, it's a bit of both.
Help me to understand that.
Yeah, well, I don't think we had the information at that time that we could disclose it, but again, going back to the management of crime scenes and excuse me, and things like that. We would always be careful what we were saying until the property was secured.
Okay. So as a matter of principle, you'd always be cautious about sharing information with householders
Yes,
until a property
yeah,
was
definitely.
secured. But do we understand that on this occasion, really, you didn't actually have any information to share?
Yes, that's fair, yeah.
Let's look at paragraph 41, please. We were asked why we were there and what we were doing probably half a dozen times by her. She was clearly annoyed at being asked to leave her property, which is fair enough. I don't fall out with that at all. We were not asked half a dozen times, one after the other. We kept giving her the information that we had, and we kept explaining to her that there was a connection and that the senior investigating officer had decided that it was being seized as a secondary crime scene. As soon as you use that terminology, crime scene, everybody thinks a crime's happened there. So it does get a bit confusing, to say the least. Police terminology, it's fine when you know what it means. We tried to explain as best we could with the information that we had. I do remember I spoke to her, and then I think DC Petrie spoke to her. I can't remember in what order. I think it was maybe in that order. So what information were you able to provide to Mrs. Rashid?
Just that there had been an incident, a serious incident in Kirkcaldy, and that someone connected with the incident had returned to that address. That's all the information that we had at that time.
Why do you think that Mrs. Rashid asked the same question half a dozen times?
Probably because she wasn't getting the information that she was seeking, to be fair to her.
Let's look at paragraph 42. Unfortunately, we were unable to tell her what exactly we were looking for. We didn't know because we weren't directly part of the inquiry. We had just come in to assist. We presumed it would be drugs or a weapon or something like that. It went backwards and forwards. I know I spoke to her and then DC Petrie spoke to her, but she wasn't happy with what we were saying, which I totally understand. If somebody was asking me to leave my house, especially under the circumstances with them two young kids, one just out of hospital and that, I wouldn't be happy either. So there's a reference here to your assumption, I think you said earlier, that ultimately drugs or a weapon were going to be looked for. So you understood that a search was going to take place. Did you yourself take part in that search?
No.
And at this moment in time, you didn't know what was going to be looked for during the search, but you made an assumption or presumption that it would be drugs or a weapon.
That's purely my own assumption.
You've mentioned Mr. Ahmed once or twice. I'd like to ask some questions about him now. If we can look at paragraph 52, please. So just to clarify, am I right to understand that when you arrived at the house and went into the house, Mrs. Rashid was there, her brother was there, and her mother was there, and you might not have seen the children, but we understand the children were in the house, and Mrs. Rashid's father arrived at a point in time after that, but before you had left?
Yes, that's correct. Mrs. Rashid wanted to phone her father to help with a bid, but also to get him to come along to speak to ourselves as well.
Paragraph 52 reads, a short time later the father arrived I believe there was another brother, but he was outside and the officers outside let the father in. The father asked very similar questions. Why was the house getting taken? Asked about a warrant, all the rest of it. And we explained to him that we had very limited information. We knew an incident happened in Kirkcaldy. We had no idea who the male was. Do you recall what you said to the father about, Mr. Ahmed, that is, about an incident involving a male?
Not exactly, no, but we did have a conversation. He was wanting to know why, obviously, the house was being seized, what it was they were looking for, what the connection was, along those lines. But again, we had limited information at that time.
53, you say, I had no idea really the connection with the house, just that prior to the incident they had travelled back to the house. That's all we knew. I suspected it might have been drugs or maybe even a bladed article. That wasn't really explained fully to us. Usually you'd be briefed about something like that, but because we'd just come in to assist, that's where we were. So again, you explain that the information that you had was really very limited, and that all you knew about there being a connection was that they had travelled back to the house. Who's they?
It's Saeed, it's singular, sorry, it's just a typo.
Can we look at paragraph 68? Halfway down, you're talking here about the questions that you were asked by Mrs. Rashid and her family. What were you looking for? Why were you there? You say, we answered on several occasions, and in hindsight, we should maybe have reached out more to the SIO and asked what more information we could disseminate to them. They had all the information that we had, basically. But I would have to say that when her father, Mr. Ahmed, came along, initially he was upset, annoyed, but he seemed to be a lot more understanding. He took control of the situation. So you say, if we can scroll up just a little bit, please, that with hindsight, you should maybe have reached out more to the SIO and asked what more information you could disseminate. Did you reach out at all to the SIO?
No, the only communication that we had was DC Petre had phoned DS Dursley a couple of times to give an update on what was happening. That would have been a link into the inquiry, if you like.
Mm-hmm. And if you had reached out to the SIO for more information that you could share with the family, how might that have helped?
Well, as you said, it was clothes that they were looking for. It could have been the case that we could have secured those clothes, and that would have negated the need to potentially decant the house. And I don't know, we didn't know at that time, but certainly with that information, if that's all they were looking for and all that they needed, we could have asked the family if we could have seized the items that they were looking for, and that would have been probably made things a lot easier.
Okay. Do you think it would have helped the family if you'd been able to give them more information about the incident and the way that the house was connected to the incident?
There's no doubt about it. Information's key to people's understanding, but I really don't think at that stage we had much information to give. But certainly the more information you can provide to someone, the better their understanding and then the better their decision making is.
So why didn't you ask the SIO if there was more information available that he could share with you, that you could share with the family?
I wasn't in contact with the inquiry in any way. As I said, the information was fed back by phone call by DC Petre, so they would have been aware of what was going on at the address. We tend to pass longer information by mobile phone rather than over the radio type thing. So it would have been a discussion that DC Petery and DS Dursley would have had. Whether the discussion about providing more information was talked about, I've no idea. I'm talking more in hindsight here, obviously.
Sure. I mean, if you had felt at the time that more information would have helped the family, could you have asked DC Petrie to make that call to DS Miller?
Definitely. If we knew it was just clothing that we're looking for, if we were able to go and secure the clothing and that's all they needed the property for, that would have been would have reduced the stress levels on all involved.
Or just more information generally about the incident and the connection of this address to the incident. If you'd realised at the time that that information might have helped the family, could you have asked DC Petrie to speak with DS Dursley?
If we knew why they were needing, what the purpose of seizing an address, what the items they were looking for, taking into consideration the occupants within the address, because as we've said, Abid was in a wheelchair, and 2 young children there as well, which I believe Mrs. Rashid had come back to her mother's address for one of the young children to recover, so she'd be there with her mother. So that would have definitely helped.
And did you have a police radio with you?
I would have, yes.
Did you have a mobile phone with you?
I would have, yes.
So if it had occurred to you at the time that more information might have been helpful, then you would have had a means of making contact directly with senior officers.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything you might do differently now?
Anything I would have done?
Anything you might do differently now in terms of getting more information from the SIO?
Yeah, as I say, in hindsight, we would have gone back and tried to establish exactly why they're wanting an address, what we could do further to assist the family.
I'd like to ask you now about the arrival of another of Mr. Ahmed's sons, that would be Mrs. Rashid's brother, another brother. If we can look at paragraph 59 of your statement, please, to get our bearings. So you're directed to a paragraph in Mr. Ahmed's statement in which he states, at one point, one of the detectives told my son that if he attempted to enter the house, they would arrest him. I can't remember for what, other than the word contempt being used. I'm asked if I recall that being said. I do recall that. I don't know if that's what was exactly said. I remember noise. I don't think we were shouted on. I think we heard the noise outside the door, and when we went to the back door, he was quite vocal and quite upset, a lot more upset than Mr. Ahmed or Mrs. Rashid. He was arguing with the officer that was on point outside. He was demanding to come into the house. We tried to explain to him that he couldn't get access to the house at this moment in time, because at that time his father was there and they were preparing to leave, and we tried to explain about the integrity of the scene. One of the things they train you as a copper, and I don't mean detectives, is if you're sitting there with a scene log, nobody's getting in. Doesn't matter if it's the chief constable comes down and demands to get in. He's not getting in. So you say that Mrs. Rashid's brother was demanding to come in. What authority did you have to stop him from coming in?
We were, as I said, we were trying to protect the scene. He was arguing with an officer outside. We were trying to reason with him the aspect that the family members were just about to come out. At that stage, Mr. Ahmed had made the decision that they were leaving and that everybody was coming out. So we were trying our best not to introduce further people to the address, if you like.
Did he live there, do you know?
I've no idea, to be honest. I don't think so, but I didn't ask. He was quite animated, very upset, to the point I closed the door on him because it seemed the best way to diffuse the situation.
Let me ask you about that. Can we look at paragraph 60, where you describe the background to you closing the door on him? He was clearly upset I don't recall saying that if he attempted to enter the house, we would arrest him, and that's not something I would say that I can remember. But if that's how he's recalling it, I do know that he was clearly upset to the extent that we just closed the door and left him outside, because it looked like one of those situations that was going to escalate as he wasn't prepared to discuss the situation. The last thing I want to be doing is restraining somebody from entering the house or anything like that. He was asked to leave, wait outside, told that the other family members were leaving, and I did close the door on him because he was really quite angry. I do remember that. I don't recall saying he would get arrested if he entered the house, but potentially it could have been something that was said, but I don't think so. So you say here, the last thing I want to be doing is restraining somebody from entering the house. On what authority would you have been able to restrain the brother to prevent him from entering the house?
I would be trying to protect the scene, to be honest. And it's more just terminology. When, as I said, the gentleman was quite upset. He was upset with what was happening to his family members having to leave. And as I said, he was more or less breaching outside at the officer that was on point. So that's why I went to try and resolve the situation. But I couldn't. As I said, he was too upset, so I just closed the door. As far as authority, well, technically, if it's his household, there's none to stop him coming in. But my job was to seize the property and try and protect the scene the best we could.
No, I understand that, but when you say in your statement then, when you make a reference to restraining him, it might just be a turn of phrase, but should we understand then that you wouldn't have had any authority to restrain him from coming in if it was his household? He was entitled to enter.
Yeah, well, as I say, we've seized that property on instructions under common law, and we're trying to protect it the best we can. Unfortunately, because the gentleman was so animated, it wasn't something that we were going to be able to reason with him, let's say. So, as I said, I closed the door to try and diffuse the situation the best we could. He wasn't left there on his own. He was there with an officer, and obviously by closing the door, that was going to stop getting access to the property as well. So that was the reason for doing that.
Okay. Let's look at paragraph 61, where you say a little bit more about closing the door. After he realised he wasn't going to be allowed in, I remember him shouting. He was saying, "I need to use the toilet. You're forcing me to piss in the garden." I said, "We're not." And he said, "What am I meant to do?" All I could suggest was somewhere just along the road. I said, "There'll be toilet facilities and there you can use." But he was animated. He wasn't the type of person you'd be able to speak to. He wasn't listening. He was clearly upset, which I don't fall out with. But I do remember I closed the door and left him with the officer outside. And that was that. I don't remember his name, though. And if we can look, before I ask you any further questions about closing the door on this gentleman, at paragraph 67, please. Where you say, this is 5 or 6 lines from the bottom, "I suppose I was abrupt, if I can call it that, when I shut the door on her brother that was outside. But that was more just to diffuse a situation that was clearly going to escalate. And at that time, I felt that was the best way to deal with it, because ultimately he was quite emotive, very angry, quite rightly so. But that's the only time we, or rather I, stopped a conversation with someone, because that one was going to escalate." So you seem sympathetic in these 2 paragraphs that we've looked at to the fact that the brother was angry, but you were concerned the situation was going to escalate.
Yes.
And you describe him as not the type of person you'd be able to speak to.
Well, what I mean by that, he was so angry at that stage. I don't mean in general. I'm sure he's a perfectly reasonable individual. It's just at that stage he was quite upset. from his perspective, his disabled brother's getting put out his property, so he's obviously going to be emotive about what's happening to the family. We had discussed it with Mrs. Rashid and with her father, and as I say, at that point the family were getting ready to leave, so that was the best way to deal with that incident. Normally I would try and speak and reason with someone. As I said, he got to the stage, I didn't for one second think that he was needing to use the toilet. He was just looking to assert himself so he could come in. That's where that had come about, and I suggested using facilities that were just a few 100 yards along the road type thing. So the best way to deal with that was just to close the door, leaving him with the other officer to reason with her.
You said that the whole purpose of you going to this address was to explain and persuade and reassure the householders. And I'm wondering what steps, if any, you took to try to calm this gentleman down, to de-escalate the situation.
I as I said, he was very, very animated. I knew that things would escalate, probably. So I just left him with the officer to speak to him. So he was so emotive, there was no way I was going to be able to reason with him.
And what effect did you think shutting the door on him was going to have?
At the end of the day, it took away probably the temptation for him to try and come in. Secondly, for him to argue with me, and thirdly, it left him with the officer to speak to him, which obviously he did, and he calmed down and waited.
And looking back, is there anything more you could have done to calm the situation down?
Not in that instance, I don't think so. As I say, unfortunately, he was quite angry at that stage, so I could have potentially gone out after he'd calmed down and spoken to him again. Is probably about the only thing I could have done.
Might providing more information have helped?
Again, yes, information's key. As I say, this gentleman's brother's getting put out his home address type thing, and he's clearly annoyed and upset about that.
And might letting him into the house have helped?
Potentially, it might have. I don't think so, though. As I say, we were at that stage where the family members were leaving. They were just getting property together to leave, so it might have, but I don't know, to be honest.
Is there anything you might do differently now?
As I say, probably go out and speak to him once he had calmed down, explain what was going on. We did try and, or rather I did try and do that when he was at the door, but he was clearly upset, so difficult to say on that one.
You've told us that you really were dependent ultimately on the householders leaving of their own accord, and I wonder whether perhaps showing a little compassion and empathy to the brother might have helped the situation?
Possibly, but I think, as I say, the decision had already been made that the family were leaving at that stage, so they were getting ready to go.
Can we look at paragraph 63 of your statement, please? Here you referred again to Mrs. Rashid's statement, where she said, "It felt like they were trying to look for something in the house. Nothing made sense as to why we were removed from our house. We were made to feel like criminals with no rights. We were treated like second..." You can scroll down, please. Thank you. Second-class citizens. We felt vulnerable and victimised. and at 64 you were asked for your reaction to Mrs. Rashid's description. All I would say is if they're in the house and they're getting asked to leave, yes, they feel victimised, I get that. I don't fall out with that at all, that's quite fair. But certainly we didn't make them feel like criminals. Maybe their perception is that they felt like that, but they were quite clearly not connected in any way, shape or form, other than that the property was connected to the incident. I can't really say much more on that. I'm sorry if she felt like that. It wasn't our intention to make people feel like that. But she was very animated from the word go, from when we got in there. She was quite annoyed, very vocal. She was clearly annoyed by what was happening, but certainly I didn't pick up that she was vulnerable. We certainly didn't try to victimise Mrs. Rashid or her family. And you say, I'm sorry if she felt like that. It wasn't our intention to make people feel like that. And I'm wondering whether, Sergeant, looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight, whether you can see whether your actions and attitude that day might inadvertently have made the occupants feel that way.
I don't think our attitude did. Certainly, our actions. We're asking somebody to leave their property that clearly don't want to leave, and again, it just comes back to potentially trying to get some more information from them. I honestly don't think in this time now that we would have the same incident, because Police Scotland sort of 8.5 years on from when they were a year old, so, or whatever it was. So I think would be the procedures and policies and that are in place now would make things probably easier to implement, I would suggest. But I don't think I honestly don't think there was anything wrong with our attitudes. When we got there, Mrs. Rashid was clearly upset and very annoyed before we got there. So what had ever happened beforehand, I can't really comment on that. But we've done our best in a very difficult situation for the family.
In paragraph 65, if we scroll to the bottom of that paragraph, please, you say if you're asked to leave your property on a Sunday afternoon and you've not particularly got a lot of information as to why, yes, certainly, it's one to reflect on. And I wanted to ask, have you reflected on the events of the 3rd of May 2015?
Well, obviously, when I was reflecting on it when I provided my statement, yes, we reflected on it. It was a particularly difficult day for myself, just in it being very challenging type thing. So we reflect on everything that we do, and could we have done things better? Of course we could. We can always improve on what we're going to do. But as I say, we had limited information. We were doing our best at that time to try and provide information and persuade the family to leave. We potentially should have gotten more information from them. I don't know if that information was even available at that time. I've no idea. But yes, of course we've reflected on it.
Could I just ask you something, picking up on that last point about information? You said that Detective Constable Petrie phoned D.S. Dursley a couple of times and updated him. What instructions came back from D.S. Dursley?
Our instructions was just to proceed on what we were doing, that the house was to be seized, and that's what we done.
And you're saying that DC Petrie explained to D.S. Dursley what was happening in the house?
I wasn't privy to the conversation, Your Honour, but obviously he gave fed back exactly what was happening in the address. So I'm not clear on what was actually said in the conversation, because he had that conversation with him. But I do know that he will have told him exactly the position that we had about the people that were within the address, and the fact that they were unwilling to leave at that stage.
And the response was,
We were still to seize the property, was what we were informed.
and what about the people in the house?
As far as I recall, we were still to persuade them to leave, which we did.
Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Thank you, sir. I wonder whether, in fact, we might go to DS Dursley's inquiry statement, SPPI 00228. Paragraph, so we can see here, let's just get our bearings. Statement of DS Graham Dursley, noted on the 26th of August and the 7th of September of last year. Can we scroll down to paragraph 154, please? This is in the context of a longer discussion about what was happening within Mrs. Rashid's family home, but DS Dursley states here that there was no feedback from the occupants about any difficulty, and he assumed that they'd given their consent to seize the property. And again, if we can look at paragraph 131. I don't remember on that day if there were concerns from the people in relation to the properties, meaning the householders effectively. I don't know if there was consent recorded or not. I don't know if further down the line there were warrants granted for examinations that took place. I wasn't aware of anyone refusing police access, because nothing was raised to me. If nothing was raised, then the householders were fine with what's taking place. If there had been an issue with any of the properties, then it would feed back to me, and I'd refer that to the SIO, and would be thinking, should we be obtaining warrants? I don't remember checking this with the officers on the day. I don't remember checking with the officers that they had permission from the householders to secure the property. So it seems to be DS Dursley's position that he was not aware of there being any of the issues that you have described in your evidence today, but it's your understanding that your Constable DC Petrie, on one or perhaps two occasions, was feeding back the difficulties that he had to DS Dursley.
That's correct, yes.
Was he making those calls within your earshot?
No, he removed himself to go and speak to them.
So it's your understanding that he was feeding back the difficulties that you were having, but you couldn't hear what he said to DS Dursley?
That's correct. I would presume he's a very professional individual, DC Petrie, so he would have given a full update of what we were facing at that time.
But as you say, that's a presumption on your part based
It
on
is,
his
yes,
professionalism.
very much so, yeah.
Because you'll appreciate, I think, that there's a tension between your understanding of what DC Petrie was saying to DS Dursley and DS Dursley's evidence that
Yes.
you didn't get to hear about any of this.
Yeah, that's right. It could well be the case. There's maybe been a breakdown in communication in an aspect that's not been communicated, but I'd be surprised that that's not been fed back, to be perfectly honest.
Just give me a moment, please.
Okay, just push it away. This is Kevin Petrie's statement. That's the number.
Apologies, Sergeant.
That's okay.
I think for completeness, I should also tell you what He now is a detective sergeant, I believe. Kevin Petrie said in his statement, he hasn't been called to give evidence, but we have an inquiry statement from him. We may not have it on our playlist, but I have a hard copy in front of me. And what I'd like to do is simply read out the relevant paragraph, just in case it is SBPI 00295. We don't have it because I didn't anticipate taking you to this, but let me read it out to you. And for the benefit of those behind me, this is paragraph 40 of his statement. I remember at some point, I think it was myself or it might have been Gordon, who contacted DS Dursley. He was the only one that we knew was linked to that because obviously the message had come from him in relation to securing that address. Just highlighting the issues that we had there around the children, trying to get a wee bit more information as to the reasons why we were there. Can't remember specifically what we were told. We were basically informed that, as part of the inquiry they were involved in, the address was required to be secured as there were items of evidence within that address. I don't think we were told what they were. We explained to them the issues around the disabled male and the kids and that being there, but he basically told us, no, it needs to be secured, and that we're asking them to see if they can find alternative accommodation or assist them in that. So does that perhaps fit more readily with the evidence that you have given today that DC Petrie had gone off to make a call or perhaps two calls and you presumed that he would be feeding back the difficulties that you were experiencing with the householders?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
So there is still a tension perhaps between your evidence and DC Petrie's and that of DS Dursley, but that will be a matter for the chair to resolve and not something that need to detain you today. Got 3 minutes. I think you'd reached the point in your evidence, Sergeant, where you have explained the difficulties that you've had with the householders. Mrs. Rashid's father had arrived, the brother had come to the door, and you said that the family members were on the point of leaving. They were getting ready
Yes.
to leave. And I wanted to ask some questions about them leaving. Mrs. Rashid, in her oral evidence to the inquiry, this was on the 8th of February, said that she felt rushed and pushed and forced and in panic mode to the point that things were left behind. Do you have any comment to make on that?
And I wasn't aware that she felt that way, to be honest. We had been there for a while, and we did encourage them to make sure they took everything with them, because again, going back to the integrity of the scene, it's difficult to come back. But no, I can't really comment on that. I wasn't aware she felt rushed. I know she talked about going back. I think she resides in Glasgow and had come through to be with her mum with it, and she certainly indicated that she was going to go back to Glasgow with the kids at that stage.
She gave evidence that she was nursing her baby and she left behind breast pumps, expressed milk and medication because of the sense of being rushed out of the house. Do you have any comment to make on that?
No, not at all. I mean, obviously, we want to make sure everybody's got as much time as they need, you know, when they're leaving. We certainly weren't forcing the fact for them to leave. But again, it was an emotive situation. They were begrudgingly leaving the property, so it stands to reason that she maybe forgot stuff when she was going.
She said in her evidence they didn't care. They just said we weren't allowed back in the house and we weren't allowed to touch anything. She was asked, did you tell them what things you needed? And she said yes. She was asked, did they offer to go and get things for you? And she said nothing. Would you like to comment on that?
I'm not aware of that at all, of her asking to get back into the address or anything like that.
So you don't recall her asking, or she didn't ask?
She didn't ask me anyway.
What would you have done if she had asked you?
If she was looking for medication and Express milk, did you say?
Yes.
We would have gotten an officer to go and get that for her. That would have been, you know, on the crime scene log, somebody would have entered the property, probably with her because it's her own stuff, but it wouldn't affected the scene in any way. She's been within there, so somebody would have gone with her to make sure she could get those items.
Sir, I'm conscious that it's 1 o'clock.
Well, we're stopping in the city again at 2 o'clock.
Line on.